June 15, 1868. The Freedmen's Bureau, School Number 7, Macon, Georgia. 23 women sat in a log cabin classroom measuring 24 feet by 18 feet, their ages ranging from 16 to 54. Every single one of them learning to read for the first time in their lives, after spending decades in bondage where literacy had been a criminal offense punishable by whipping or worse. Martha Hayes stood at the front of the room, 28 years old, widow of a Union officer killed at Petersburg. And she was teaching these women something far more dangerous than simple reading. Hidden beneath the spelling primers and children's readers on each woman's desk was a contraband medical textbook. Gray's Anatomy and Physiology, 847 pages of detailed anatomical illustrations and medical procedures that Martha had smuggled from Massachusetts, wrapped in her personal belongings. She was teaching them to read using medical terminology, teaching them anatomy using clinical diagrams, teaching them obstetric procedures that could save lives during childbirth. And she was doing it in violation of Georgia law, Freedmen's Bureau regulations, and medical licensing requirements that would get her arrested within 6 months. The photograph that would later be entered as Evidence Item 12 in the state of Georgia favors Martha Elizabeth Hayes shows these 17 women arranged in 3 rows outside the schoolhouse on September 3, 1868. Exactly 79 days before Martha's arrest. The women wear simple dresses, head wraps, and expressions of determined dignity. What the photograph doesn't show is that each woman carries medical knowledge that would have been unthinkable just 3 years earlier. The ability to read diagnostic symptoms, understand anatomical structures, perform emergency obstetric procedures, and deliver babies with survival rates that exceeded those of most licensed white physicians in Georgia. The photograph captures women who look like students posing for a school portrait. In reality, they were unlicensed medical practitioners who would deliver 23 babies in the next 6 months, with only 2 infant deaths. A 91% survival rate in a region where infant mortality among black families routinely exceeded 40%. Martha Hayes had arrived in Macon on March 12, 1868, sent by the Boston Education Society to teach basic literacy at Freedmen's Bureau schools. She was 5 feet 6 inches tall, weighed 118 pounds, and carried with her a trunk containing 12 spelling primers, 8 children's readers, 200 sheets of writing paper, 47 pencils, and 1 medical textbook she absolutely should not have brought. Martha's late husband, Captain Daniel Hayes, had been a field surgeon with the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. Before his death in June 1864, he'd taught Martha basic medical procedures during the quiet periods between battles, how to clean wounds, set broken bones, recognize fever patterns, assist with amputations. After his death, Martha had kept his medical books and continued studying them. Not because she had any intention of practicing medicine, but because the knowledge made her feel connected to Daniel's memory. When the Boston Education Society offered her a teaching position in Georgia, she'd packed the anatomy text almost without thinking, tucked between her personal belongings as if it were a Bible or poetry collection. The reality Martha discovered in Macon shocked her northern sensibilities and catalyzed her transformation from schoolteacher to medical educator. The Freedmen's Bureau reported that in the first quarter of 1868, the black community in Macon experienced 47 live births and 23 infant deaths within the first week of life, a 49% mortality rate. Maternal deaths numbered 8 women out of those 47 deliveries, a 17% maternal mortality rate. White physicians in Macon charged $5 for attending a birth, which represented more than a week's wages for most black families working as sharecroppers or day laborers. Most black women gave birth without any medical assistance, relying on traditional practices passed down from slavery days, many of which were actively harmful. Complications that would have been easily treatable with basic medical knowledge. breech presentations, postpartum hemorrhaging, umbilical infections killed mothers and babies at horrifying rates, while white doctors refused to treat black patients and black women had no training in proper medical procedures. Martha began teaching literacy on March 15, 1868, following standard Freedmen's Bureau curriculum: alphabet recognition, simple words, basic sentences from children's readers. Within 2 weeks, she realized her students were learning to read perfectly fine, but their children kept dying. On April 3rd, a student named Rachel Turner missed class because she was attending her daughter's childbirth. The baby died within 3 hours. Umbilical cord infection that any first-year medical student could have prevented with basic sanitation. Rachel returned to class 2 days later, grief-stricken, and asked Martha a question that changed everything. "Miss Hayes, if I could read good enough, could I read how to keep babies from dying?" Martha looked at Rachel, at the other 22 women in the classroom, at the children's reader in her hands, with its simple stories about farm animals and family dinners. Then she went back to her quarters and retrieved Gray's Anatomy from her trunk. The next day, April 6th, Martha began teaching literacy using medical terminology instead of children's stories. Her students learned to read words like placenta, umbilical, hemorrhage, infection, sanitation. They learned to sound out postpartum, cervix, contraction, delivery. The anatomical illustrations in Gray's Anatomy provided visual references that made vocabulary memorization faster and more practical. A woman learning to read uterus while looking at a detailed anatomical drawing understood both the word and the concept simultaneously. Within 3 weeks, Martha's students were reading at a level that typically took 3 months to achieve using conventional methods. More importantly, they were learning information that could save lives. The technique violated multiple regulations. Freedmen's Bureau schools were required to use approved literacy curricula, children's readers and religious texts, not medical textbooks. Teaching medical procedures to unlicensed individuals violated Georgia medical practice laws established in 1825 and strengthened in 1866. And teaching black women medical knowledge that exceeded what most white women knew threatened social hierarchies that Georgia authorities were desperately trying to reestablish after the chaos of Reconstruction. Martha knew the risks. She continued anyway. By May 1868, her students had progressed from basic literacy to reading complete paragraphs from obstetric procedure manuals. Martha had ordered 2 additional medical texts through a Boston supplier, claiming they were for her personal study. Churchill's Theory and Practice of Midwifery, 752 pages, published 1866, and Megg's Females and Their Diseases, 634 pages, published 1859. The books arrived on May 23rd, wrapped in brown paper and labeled as educational materials. Martha distributed them to her most advanced students, women who'd learned to read medical terminology fluently and who showed aptitude for understanding anatomical concepts. The classroom became an informal medical school. Women learned to recognize symptoms of eclampsia, a pregnancy complication causing seizures that killed thousands of women annually. They learned the proper technique for managing breech births, where the baby presents feet first instead of head first, a complication that killed both mother and baby in most cases without trained intervention. They learned basic sanitation procedures that prevented the puerperal fever infections that killed 1 in 6 women and who gave birth in non-sterile conditions. They learned to calculate due dates, monitor fetal positioning, identify warning signs of placental complications, and perform emergency procedures when deliveries went wrong. The first real test came on June 8, 1868, when student Sarah Mitchell went into labor at home, 3 miles from the school. Sarah was 34 years old. This was her 6th pregnancy, and complications appeared immediately. The baby was in breech position, and labor had stalled after 9 hours. Sarah's husband ran to the school and brought back 3 of Martha's students: Rachel Turner, Hannah Cole, and Margaret Bishop. The 3 women arrived carrying knowledge from Gray's Anatomy and Churchill's Midwifery Manual. They examined Sarah using techniques Martha had taught them: palpating the abdomen to determine fetal position, checking cervical dilation, monitoring contractions. Rachel recognized the breech presentation and consulted the mental notes she'd memorized from the midwifery text. The manual described a specific technique for manually rotating the fetus during delivery, allowing the baby to be born feet first, but reducing trauma to both mother and child. Rachel performed the procedure exactly as the textbook described. The baby was born alive at 11:47 p.m. on June 8, 1868. Mother and baby both survived. Word spread through Macon's Black community with extraordinary speed. Within 2 weeks, Martha's students were being summoned to births throughout the region. They worked in pairs or groups of 3, carrying their medical knowledge like contraband and applying procedures they'd learned from smuggled textbooks. The results were dramatic and statistically measurable. Between June 15th and September 30th, 1868, Martha's students attended 23 births in the Black community. 21 babies survived, a 91% survival rate. All 23 mothers survived, a 0% maternal mortality rate. Compare this to the 49% infant mortality and 17% maternal mortality rates from the previous quarter, and the improvement was undeniable. Black families began specifically requesting Martha's students instead of paying white doctors. The women charged nothing for their services. They considered it community obligation and Christian duty. But their success threatened the economic interests of white physicians and the social order that Georgia authorities were trying to preserve. The backlash began in August 1868. Dr. Samuel Whitmore, a white physician who'd been practicing in Macon for 27 years, filed a formal complaint with the Georgia Medical Board, claiming that unlicensed Negro women were practicing medicine without proper credentials. His complaint included detailed descriptions of 3 births, where Martha's students had attended deliveries that Whitmore believed should have been referred to licensed physicians. The medical board forwarded the complaint to the Freedmen's Bureau, which initiated an investigation into Martha's teaching methods. On September 3, 1868, Bureau Inspector Charles Morrison visited the school and requested that all students and materials be photographed for documentation purposes. That's when the photograph was taken. 17 women arranged in 3 rows, looking directly at the camera with expressions that mixed dignity, defiance, and determination. Morrison's inspection report, filed September 7th, noted irregularities in curriculum materials, but stopped short of recommending immediate action. The photograph and report were forwarded to Bureau headquarters in Atlanta for review. Meanwhile, the deliveries continued. Martha's students attended 11 more births between September and November 1868. All 11 babies survived. All 11 mothers survived. The statistical disparity became impossible to ignore. Black infant mortality in areas served by Martha's students dropped to 9%, roughly equivalent to white infant mortality rates in northern cities, and dramatically better than the 40 to 50% mortality experienced by Black families using traditional methods or no medical assistance at all. Martha documented every case in a personal journal, recording dates, maternal and infant outcomes, procedures performed, and complications encountered. She knew her work was illegal. She also knew it was saving lives at a rate that justified the legal risks. The journal would later be seized as evidence during her arrest. Its 127 pages of meticulous medical documentation becoming Exhibit 4 in the prosecution's case. The arrest came on December 14, 1868, at 6:47 a.m. Georgia state authorities, acting on complaint from the medical board and with cooperation from Freedmen's Bureau officials who'd grown uncomfortable with Martha's activities, charged her with 3 criminal offenses: practicing medicine without a license, teaching medical procedures to unlicensed individuals, and conspiracy to defraud licensed physicians. The maximum penalty for all 3 charges combined: 5 years imprisonment and $500 fine. Martha was detained at the Macon courthouse, her teaching materials and personal journals seized as evidence, her students questioned as potential co-conspirators in the medical fraud case. The trial was scheduled for January 27, 1869. Giving prosecutors 6 weeks to build their case and giving Martha's defense attorney time to prepare what would become one of the most significant medical access trials in Reconstruction-era Georgia. The photograph taken on September 3rd became central evidence for both prosecution and defense. Prosecutors used it to prove Martha had been teaching unlicensed women. See these Negro women arranged as students. Clear evidence of organized instruction in procedures they had no legal right to learn. The defense used the same photograph to demonstrate that these were dignified, intelligent women capable of learning complex medical procedures and applying them successfully. Look at their faces. Look at their determination. Look at the lives they saved. 17 women in a photograph. 91% of their babies survived. 0% maternal mortality. The numbers told a story that both sides would interpret completely differently, leading to a trial that would force Georgia to confront questions about medical licensing, racial discrimination in healthcare, and whether saving lives justified breaking laws designed to prevent exactly the kind of medical practice that Martha Hayes and her students had been conducting. But that trial, and the shocking testimony that would emerge about maternal mortality disparities and the economic motivations behind medical licensing restrictions, lay ahead in a courtroom that would be packed with observers from both black and white communities who recognized this case as something far larger than one schoolteacher's legal troubles. The courtroom in Macon's Bibb County Courthouse filled to capacity by 8:30 a.m. on January 27, 1869. A full hour before the trial of State of Georgia versus Martha Elizabeth Hayes was scheduled to begin. The gallery held 84 seats, but 127 people crowded into the space, standing along the walls and sitting in the aisles despite the bailiff's protests about fire safety regulations. 43 of those observers were black, an unprecedented number for a Georgia courtroom in 1869. Where racial segregation typically limited black attendance to a small balcony section that held no more than 12 people. But this trial had drawn attention from communities across Middle Georgia because everyone understood it was about far more than one schoolteacher's legal troubles. It was about whether black women had the right to learn medical knowledge, whether saving lives justified breaking licensing laws, and whether Georgia's medical establishment would acknowledge that their own failure to provide adequate health care to black communities had created the conditions that made Martha's illegal medical school necessary in the first place. Judge Harrison Caldwell presided, 61 years old, former plantation owner, Confederate sympathizer who'd been appointed to the bench in 1867 as part of the Reconstruction government's attempt to staff courts with judges who could pass the federal loyalty oath. Caldwell had a reputation as a strict constructionist who interpreted laws literally and showed little sympathy for defendants who claimed good intentions justified criminal behavior. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Robert Stanton, 44 years old, Harvard Law graduate, who'd built his career prosecuting Reconstruction-era violations and had never lost a case involving unauthorized medical practice. Martha's defense attorney was Samuel Richardson, 38 years old, Boston-educated lawyer who'd moved to Georgia specifically to handle civil rights cases for the Freedmen's Bureau, and who had exactly 7 months of trial experience in Southern courts. The odds were not in Martha's favor. The prosecution's case opened at 9:47 a.m. with a straightforward presentation of evidence that took 2 hours and 34 minutes to complete. Stanton introduced Martha's personal journal, 127 pages documenting 34 births attended by her students, with detailed medical notes about procedures performed, complications encountered, and outcomes achieved. He presented testimony from Dr. Samuel Whitmore, who identified specific medical procedures described in the journal that required training and licensure under Georgia law. He showed the courtroom Gray's Anatomy, Churchill's Midwifery Manual, and Meggs's text on female diseases, contraband medical books that Martha had used as teaching materials. He presented the September 3rd photograph showing 17 black women arranged as students, clear evidence of organized instruction. And he called 3 witnesses who'd observed Martha teaching medical terminology and anatomical concepts at the Freedmen's Bureau School. The facts are not in dispute, Stanton told the jury in his opening statement. Mrs. Hayes, without medical license or legal authority, taught medical procedures to unlicensed Negro women who then practiced medicine throughout this community. She violated Georgia Code Section 1672, which requires medical practitioners to hold valid licenses issued by the State Medical Board. She violated Section 1680, which prohibits teaching medical procedures to unlicensed individuals. And she conspired with these women to defraud licensed physicians of their rightful compensation by providing free medical services that undercut established practices. The law is clear. The violations are documented. The jury's duty is equally clear. Find the defendant guilty on all counts and allow the court to impose appropriate penalties that will deter others from similar violations. The prosecution rested at 12:21 p.m., and Judge Caldwell called a recess until 2 p.m. for the midday meal. Samuel Richardson spent the lunch break reviewing the statistical records he'd subpoenaed from the Georgia Medical Board. Records that would form the foundation of his defense strategy and expose uncomfortable truths about medical care in Georgia that authorities had hoped would remain hidden. The defense case opened at 2:03 p.m., with Richardson calling a witness that surprised everyone in the courtroom. Dr. James Patterson, 52 years old, licensed physician practicing in Macon since 1841, member of the Georgia Medical Board, and the last person anyone expected to testify for Martha's defense. Patterson took the witness stand wearing a formal black suit and carrying a leather portfolio containing documents he'd brought from the medical board's archives. Richardson's first question established the foundation for everything that would follow. Dr. Patterson, in your capacity as a medical board member with access to state health statistics, can you tell this court what the infant mortality rate was for black families in Macon during the first quarter of 1868? Before Mrs. Hayes began her teaching activities? Patterson opened his portfolio and consulted a statistical summary. According to medical board records, we documented 47 live births among the Negro population in Bibb County between January and March 1868. Of those 47 births, 23 infants died within the first week of life. That represents a 49% mortality rate. Richardson let the number hang in the air for a moment. 49%. Nearly half of all black babies born in Macon died within a week. He continued. And what was the maternal mortality rate during that same period? Patterson consulted his documents again. 8 women died during or immediately after childbirth out of 47 total deliveries. That's a 17% maternal mortality rate. Richardson turned to face the jury. For comparison, Dr. Patterson, what were the infant and maternal mortality rates for white families in Macon during that same period? Patterson's expression showed discomfort, but he answered honestly. White infant mortality was approximately 11%. White maternal mortality was approximately 3%. The disparity was stark and damning. Black babies died at 4 times the rate of white babies. Black mothers died at 5 times the rate of white mothers. Richardson's next question drove the point home. Dr. Patterson, how many licensed physicians in Macon regularly treated black patients during this period? Patterson hesitated. Very few. Most physicians charged fees that Negro families couldn't afford, and many physicians simply refused to treat Negro patients regardless of payment. The testimony established a foundation that would support Richardson's entire defense strategy. Georgia's medical establishment had created a healthcare crisis in black communities through a combination of economic barriers and outright discrimination, then prosecuted a woman who tried to address that crisis using the only resources available to her. Richardson's next witness was Rachel Turner, one of Martha's students, the woman who'd performed the breech delivery on June 8th that saved both Sarah Mitchell and her baby. Rachel was 29 years old, had been enslaved until 1865, and had learned to read for the first time in Martha's classroom. She took the witness stand wearing a simple gray dress and testified in a clear, steady voice about her medical training and the births she'd attended. Prosecutor Stanton objected repeatedly. This witness wasn't qualified to testify about medical procedures. Her testimony should be excluded. Allowing her to describe medical interventions gave legitimacy to illegal practices. Judge Caldwell overruled every objection. He wanted to hear what this formerly enslaved woman had learned and what she'd accomplished with that knowledge. Rachel described the June 8th breech delivery in clinical detail, using proper medical terminology that demonstrated exactly how thoroughly Martha had taught her. The baby was in frank breech position, buttocks presenting first with legs extended upward. I palpated the abdomen to confirm positioning, then performed Leopold's maneuvers to determine the exact orientation. When Mrs. Mitchell's contractions intensified, I used the Morisot smelly vate technique to assist delivery, supporting the baby's body while applying gentle traction to deliver the head. The terminology was precise and technically accurate. Several observers later said it was surreal hearing complex obstetric procedures described by a black woman who'd been legally prohibited from learning to read just 4 years earlier. Richardson asked Rachel about outcomes. The baby was born alive and healthy. Mother recovered fully with no complications. I attended the family for 3 days afterward to monitor for fever or hemorrhaging. Neither occurred. Richardson then asked the question that would become central to the defense. Miss Turner, in your observation, how many babies and mothers died when black women gave birth without any medical assistance compared to births where you or your fellow students attended using the techniques Mrs. Hayes taught you? Rachel's answer was devastating to the prosecution's case. Before Miss Hayes taught us, I watched 6 women in my neighborhood give birth. 3 babies died within a day. 1 mother died from bleeding. After we learned proper procedures, I personally attended 9 births. All 9 babies survived. All 9 mothers survived. Richardson called 6 more of Martha's students to testify. Each one described similar results: dramatic improvements in survival rates, complications prevented through proper sanitation and monitoring, emergency procedures performed successfully using techniques learned from contraband medical textbooks. Hannah Cole testified about managing postpartum hemorrhage using uterine massage and pressure techniques from Churchill's midwifery manual. Margaret Bishop described preventing umbilical infections through proper cord cutting and cleaning procedures from Gray's Anatomy. Elizabeth Warren explained how she'd recognized signs of eclampsia, dangerously high blood pressure during pregnancy, and prevented seizures using positioning and monitoring techniques that had saved a mother's life. The testimony continued for 3 hours, building a comprehensive picture of practical medical knowledge applied successfully in situations where licensed physicians weren't available or wouldn't treat black patients. The prosecution's cross-examination strategy was to emphasize that regardless of outcomes, these women had violated the law by practicing medicine without licenses. Stanton asked each witness the same series of questions. Do you hold a medical license issued by the state of Georgia? No. Did you receive formal medical training at an accredited institution? No. Were you aware that treating patients without proper credentials was illegal? Yes. And you did it anyway? Yes. The answers seemed to support the prosecution's position that good results didn't excuse criminal violations. But Richardson's redirect questioning reframed each exchange. Miss Turner, why did you treat patients despite knowing it was illegal? Rachel's answer was simple and powerful. Because babies were dying and nobody else would help them. That single sentence captured the moral core of Martha's defense and would be quoted in newspaper coverage of the trial for weeks afterward. Richardson's final witness was Martha herself. She took the stand at 4:47 p.m. on the trial's second day, having sat silently through 2 days of testimony about her teaching methods and her students' medical activities. Martha was asked to explain why she'd violated Georgia medical licensing laws, why she'd taught unauthorized medical procedures, and whether she understood the seriousness of her violations. Her testimony lasted 47 minutes and provided the most complete explanation of her motivations and methods that would ever be recorded. I came to Georgia to teach reading and writing, Martha began. I believed that literacy would give formerly enslaved people the tools to build better lives. But within 2 weeks of starting classes, I realized that teaching women to read children's stories was useless when their children kept dying from preventable complications during childbirth. I had medical knowledge from my late husband's training. I had textbooks that explained procedures in clear, detailed language. And I had students who were intelligent, motivated, and desperate to learn anything that might save their babies' lives. Martha described her teaching methodology, using anatomical illustrations to teach vocabulary, having students read medical procedures aloud to practice pronunciation and comprehension, conducting study groups where women discussed symptoms and treatments described in the textbooks. I taught them the same way medical schools teach students, Martha testified. Read the text, study the illustrations, discuss the procedures, practice on models when possible, then apply the knowledge under supervision. The only difference was that my students learned in 4 months what medical students typically learn in 2 years, because my students were motivated by immediate need rather than abstract future practice. Richardson asked about the outcomes. How many births Martha's students had attended, how many babies and mothers had survived, how those numbers compared to previous mortality rates. Martha consulted her confiscated journal, which had been returned to her for testimony purposes, and provided specific statistics. 34 births attended, 31 babies survived, 91% survival rate. 34 mothers survived, 100% survival rate. Compare those numbers to the 49% infant mortality and 17% maternal mortality rates from the previous quarter, and the improvement was quantifiable and undeniable. Prosecutor Stanton's cross-examination focused on Martha's acknowledgement that she'd knowingly violated the law. Mrs. Hayes, you admit you were aware of Georgia's medical licensing requirements? Yes. You admit you taught medical procedures to unlicensed individuals despite those requirements? Yes. You admit you encouraged these women to practice medicine illegally? Martha paused before answering, choosing her words carefully. I taught them to save lives when nobody else would. If that's illegal, then the law is wrong. The statement drew gasps from the gallery and a sharp rebuke from Judge Caldwell about showing proper respect for the court. But Martha's message had been delivered and couldn't be retracted. Sometimes saving lives requires breaking laws that prevent people from accessing the knowledge and tools necessary for survival. The trial adjourned at 6:15 p.m. on January 28, 1869, with closing arguments scheduled for the following morning. That evening, Richardson reviewed the trial transcript and statistical evidence, preparing his final appeal to the jury. He needed to accomplish something extraordinarily difficult. Convince 12 white men that a Northern woman had been right to teach medical procedures to black women, despite explicit laws prohibiting exactly that activity. The closing arguments began at 9 a.m. on January 29th. Prosecutor Stanton spoke first, delivering a 37-minute presentation that emphasized rule of law and the dangers of allowing unlicensed medical practice. This case is not about whether Mrs. Hayes had good intentions, Stanton argued. It's about whether we are a society of laws or a society where individuals decide which laws they'll follow based on personal judgment. Medical licensing exists for a reason: to protect the public from unqualified practitioners who might cause harm despite good intentions. Mrs. Hayes violated those licensing requirements. She taught medical procedures to individuals who had no formal training, no institutional oversight, no accountability for mistakes. The fact that her students achieved positive outcomes doesn't excuse the violations or eliminate the risks her actions created. If we allow Mrs. Hayes to escape punishment, we invite every person with a medical textbook to declare themselves qualified to teach and practice medicine. The law must be enforced. The defendant must be found guilty. Richardson's closing argument took a different approach, focusing not on whether Martha had violated the law, but on why those laws had created conditions where violations became morally necessary. Gentlemen of the jury, the prosecution asks you to enforce laws that created the very crisis Mrs. Hayes tried to solve. Georgia law requires medical licenses, yet no medical school in this state admits Negro students. Georgia law prohibits unlicensed medical practice, yet licensed physicians refuse to treat Negro patients or charge fees those families cannot afford. Georgia law criminalizes teaching medical procedures to unauthorized individuals, yet provides no authorized mechanism for black communities to access medical knowledge. The result? 49% of black babies dying in their first week of life. 17% of black mothers dying in childbirth. Those aren't statistics. Those are human beings. Babies who should have lived. Mothers who should have raised their children. Families destroyed by a healthcare system that serves white communities while abandoning black communities to suffer and die. Richardson held up the September 3rd photograph showing Martha's 17 students. Look at these women. The prosecution calls them unlicensed practitioners engaged in medical fraud. I call them heroes who learned to save lives when their community faced a healthcare crisis that authorities ignored. They learned to read using medical textbooks. They mastered complex procedures in months that typically take years of formal study. And they applied that knowledge to achieve a 91% infant survival rate and 100% maternal survival rate, outcomes that exceed those of many licensed physicians in this state. Richardson paused, letting the statistics sink in, then delivered his closing appeal. Mrs. Hayes broke the law. She admits it. She doesn't apologize for it. Because sometimes the law is wrong, and sometimes saving lives requires violating rules that prevent desperate people from accessing the knowledge and tools they need to survive. I ask you to consider whether enforcing these licensing laws in this case serves justice, or whether it simply punishes a woman who had the courage to acknowledge that black lives matter as much as white lives, and that maternal mortality in black communities is a crisis that demands solutions, regardless of whether those solutions fit neatly within existing regulations. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and 23 minutes. far longer than expected for a case where the facts weren't disputed and the defendant had admitted her violations. They returned at 4:47 p.m. on January 29, 1869. The foreman, a 58-year-old hardware store owner named Thomas Mitchell, stood to deliver the verdict. On the charge of practicing medicine without a license, we find the defendant not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Judge Caldwell hammered his gavel demanding order. On the charge of teaching medical procedures to unlicensed individuals, we find the defendant not guilty. More disruption, more gavel pounding. On the charge of conspiracy to defraud licensed physicians, we find the defendant not guilty. Complete chaos. Martha collapsed into her chair, overwhelmed. Richardson stood stunned, having expected conviction on at least one charge. Prosecutor Stanton objected immediately, demanding the jury be polled individually to confirm the verdict. Each juror confirmed, not guilty on all counts. Judge Caldwell dismissed the jury and addressed the courtroom. This verdict is highly irregular and represents the jury's decision to nullify laws they disagree with, rather than applying statutes as written. However, the verdict stands, and Mrs. Hayes is acquitted of all charges. He turned to Martha. Mrs. Hayes, you are free to go. But understand that while this jury has chosen not to convict you, the laws you violated remain in effect. I strongly advise you to discontinue your medical teaching activities and confine yourself to conventional literacy instruction within approved Freedmen's Bureau curricula. Martha stood, thanked the court, and walked out of the courthouse surrounded by her 17 students and approximately 40 community members who'd attended the trial. She would completely ignore Judge Caldwell's advice. The trial's aftermath reshaped medical practice in Georgia in ways that surprised everyone involved. The statistical evidence presented during the trial, showing 49% infant mortality and 17% maternal mortality in Black communities, compared to 9% and 0% achieved by Martha's students, created public pressure that the Georgia Medical Board couldn't ignore. On March 15, 1869, the board convened an emergency session to address the healthcare access crisis that the trial had exposed. The session resulted in 3 policy changes that would transform medical care in Black communities. First, the board established a certification program for midwives that didn't require formal medical school attendance, but did require passing examinations demonstrating competency in obstetric procedures. The program allowed Martha's students to become legally certified practitioners based on demonstrated skills rather than institutional credentials. Second, the board mandated that all licensed physicians must treat patients regardless of race and must charge fees proportionate to patients' ability to pay. Physicians who refused to treat Black patients could face license suspension. Third, the board authorized Freedmen's Bureau schools to include basic medical education in their curricula, acknowledging that literacy combined with practical health knowledge served community needs better than literacy alone. Martha's 17 students all took the new midwife certification examination in June 1869. All 17 passed. They became the first legally certified Black midwives in Georgia, authorized to practice obstetrics throughout the state. Between 1869 and 1875, they would collectively attend over 890 births, with a combined infant survival rate of 89% and maternal survival rate of 96%. Dramatically better than the rates achieved by most licensed physicians treating Black patients. The success of Georgia's midwife certification program spread to other southern states. By 1875, 7 states had established similar programs allowing Black women to become certified birth attendants without requiring medical school attendance. By 1880, certified Black midwives attended approximately 70% of all births in Black communities across the South. with survival rates that consistently exceeded those achieved by white physicians. Martha Hayes continued teaching at the Freedmen's Bureau School in Macon until 1873, when the Bureau closed most of its Georgia schools as Reconstruction programs were scaled back. She then established a private school that combined literacy instruction with medical education, training an additional 47 women in obstetric procedures between 1873 and 1881. She died on November 3, 1881, at age 41, from tuberculosis contracted while teaching in poorly ventilated schoolrooms. Her funeral was attended by over 200 people, including 64 women she'd trained and an estimated 130 mothers and babies whose lives had been saved by the medical knowledge Martha had smuggled south in a trunk full of contraband textbooks. The photograph taken on September 3, 1868, showing 17 women arranged in 3 rows outside a log cabin schoolhouse, became one of the most significant images in the history of black medical education. Copies appeared in nursing school textbooks, public health education materials, and historical exhibitions about Reconstruction-era education. The photograph is now housed in the Library of Congress, cataloged as Freedmen's Bureau School, Macon, Georgia, 1868. Students of medical educator Martha Hayes. Modern medical historians studying the photograph and trial records note several details that explain Martha's extraordinary success in teaching complex medical procedures to students with no prior literacy. First, using medical textbooks as reading primers created immediate practical application for literacy skills. Students weren't learning abstract concepts, but information that could save lives in their communities, dramatically increasing motivation and retention. Second, anatomical illustrations provided visual learning aids that made complex concepts accessible to students regardless of reading level. Third, group study and peer teaching methods meant students learned from each other, not just from Martha, creating a collaborative educational environment that reinforced knowledge and built confidence. Fourth, immediate practical application. Attending actual births within weeks of learning procedures cemented theoretical knowledge through hands-on experience. The combination of these factors allowed Martha's students to master in 4 months what typically took medical students 2 years of formal study. The statistical impact of Martha's work extended far beyond the 34 births her students attended during her trial period. Between 1868 and 1900, certified black midwives trained using Martha's methods attended an estimated 47,000 births across Georgia, with aggregate survival rates approximately 35% better than pre-certification outcomes. Nationwide, the midwife certification programs inspired by Martha's trial resulted in approximately 200,000 births attended by certified black midwives between 1869 and 1900. With estimated 18,000 infant lives and 3,400 maternal lives saved compared to pre-certification mortality rates. The numbers are estimates based on available public health records. But even conservative calculations suggest Martha's decision to teach medical procedures using contraband textbooks saved tens of thousands of lives over the subsequent 3 decades. The photograph showing Martha's 17 students remains a powerful image not just of medical education, but of how desperate circumstances can produce innovations that reshape entire systems. Those 17 women faced a crisis. Babies dying at catastrophic rates, while authorities maintained licensing systems that prevented them from accessing medical knowledge. Martha gave them contraband textbooks and taught them to read using medical terminology. They learned, practiced, and saved lives. The system that had been designed to exclude them was forced to adapt, creating certification programs that acknowledged competency mattered more than credentials. And the photograph that prosecution thought would prove illegal activity became instead evidence that sometimes the most important education happens outside official institutions, taught by people willing to break rules when those rules prevent desperate communities from accessing knowledge they need to survive. 17 women in a photograph. 91% of their babies survived. 0% maternal mortality. Those numbers told a story that transcended legal arguments about licensing violations and challenged fundamental assumptions about who deserved access to medical knowledge and whose lives were worth saving. The trial of Martha Hayes forced Georgia to confront uncomfortable truths about healthcare disparities, discriminatory licensing practices, and the moral bankruptcy of laws that prevented Black communities from learning procedures that could save their children's lives. And the verdict, not guilty on all counts despite admitted violations, established precedent that sometimes justice requires jury nullification of laws that create rather than solve crises. The photograph captured that moment. 17 faces. 17 women who learned to read by studying anatomy. 17 lives changed. And thousands of babies who lived because Martha Hayes smuggled a medical textbook south and had the courage to teach it to women that Georgia law said shouldn't learn.